I'm Mary Edwards, I'm 27, and I'm standing on the steps of a packed stone church with a leather folio in one hand and a wireless mic in the other. Charlotte, my older sister, climbs out of a white limo, veil pinned, already smiling. Naomi Brooks, the MC I hired, stands by a small portable speaker. Victor Miles, the venue manager, watches the doors. Daniel Carter, my sister's fiancé, adjusts his cufflinks. Karen Carter, the groom's mother, grips her clutch. Theo Grant, the best man, looks anywhere but at me. A boxy LED billboard truck idles at the curb, screens black for now. Paul Jensen, the process server I retained, waits 3 paces behind me with a manila envelope. I flip open the folio so the lab's seal catches the light and tap the mic once. "Good morning," I say. "Before anyone walks inside, we need to correct the record." When Charlotte sees the seal and recognizes the folio, her face drains. "Before I tell you everything that led up to this, tell me where you're listening from in the comments. I read them. Subscribe and switch on notifications if you want more first-person family revenge stories." Now, here's how I built this day piece by piece. I grew up learning to be useful the way other kids learn to ride a bike. I wasn't the loud one or the pretty one or the one every neighbor remembered by name. I was the reliable one. That meant Mom called me mature the way people pat a dog for sitting, impressed but not surprised. Charlotte was always the promise, the one who could get a scholarship, get the curtain call, get the man who complimented her dress. I was the proof we could manage the aftermath. From early on, responsibility fell to me like rain. If the garbage needed moving, if a bill landed on a kitchen table and then vanished, if a teacher wanted a parent at a conference, Mom and Dad looked at me. "Be the bigger person," Dad would say, as if that was a gift and a burden wrapped together. Whenever Charlotte's life swelled with drama, broken car, bad breakup, a late rent, my name showed up in the margins of the plan to fix it. I learned to do the unseen work and make it look like nothing. I cooked, repaired, loaned money, calmed conversations, smoothed schedules. I unclenched my jaw in silence so the noise would pass. Being dependable wasn't love. It was a function the family expected to perform without complaint. When I told people I wanted different things, time alone to study, money for a class, a day to rest, the answer wasn't "of course." It was a careful rehearsal of why I shouldn't. Charlotte took the bows, I took the bills. Mom praised Charlotte's charm and paused at me with practiced admiration. "You always do so much." That praise came with conditions. "You know how to do without," Mom said when Charlotte needed a favor. Those words were less comfort than instruction. I learned early that my patience would be read as an endless pocket to dip into. When Ruth left her small estate, it felt like the nearest thing to permission I would ever get to build something for myself. Ruth, my grandmother, was quiet in the way a lighthouse is quiet. She didn't shout, but you could steer by her. She left money split between Charlotte and me, and while Charlotte immediately pictured a party, I pictured an oven. I formed an LLC with Ruth's check as seed money. I filled out permits, made a lean business plan, and sketched a menu for a bakery that would not be a hobby or a weekend thing, but a first step toward independence. I wrote budgets that surprised me by being small and possible. A used convection oven, starter inventory, deposits for a shared commercial kitchen, business cards that didn't feel like jokes. Ruth's money covered a good chunk of those things. I opened a separate bank account in the LLC's name and kept every receipt. I signed forms and filed paperwork because I had seen how quickly "I'll pay you back" can turn into silence. Charlotte kept saying she'd support me when she could. "Just until the wedding," she told me once, which sounded like love until it didn't. Mom agreed with that tone, practical, soothing. I counted the dollars like a map back to a life that was mine, not borrowed. Charlotte had a way of asking that made refusal sound selfish. "Can you borrow my dress?" she'd ask. "Then can you use your car? Then can you cover this fee?" It started small, short-term loans, errands, and grew into a system where favor became expectation. When I reminded her that she owed me, she renamed debts gifts with a laugh and a flourish. If I pushed, she called me dramatic. If I stayed quiet, she framed my silence as generosity. Mom often smoothed over the edge, saying she's under pressure, as if pressure rewrote obligations into mercy. I kept ledgers in the corner of my phone. I tracked transfers, dates, and the context of every favor. There was no revenge in that, it was sanity. Numbers don't argue back. The more Charlotte leaned on me, the more everyone else accepted it as normal. Friends started treating me like a service. Need a ride? Text Mary. Need a favor? Text Mary. My reliability became my brand, and the world mistook it for limitless bandwidth. Charlotte escalated her asks: more money, more urgency, fewer thanks. When I said later, she heard now. When I said no, she heard a challenge to be coaxed into compliance. Mom and Dad rarely intervened. They accepted the pattern like weather, annoying but inevitable. Mom's excuses were the cushioning that let Charlotte land soft. She would tell me stories about how hard things had been for Charlotte, how everyone needed a moment. "You're practical," she'd say, almost like a benediction. If I resisted, Mom would accuse me of sabotaging my sister's joy, a cruel phrase that made me second-guess the importance of my own needs. Dad's response was quieter but no less effective. "We don't need to do this today," he'd say, and the words closed the door on conflict. He didn't defend me, he avoided the fight entirely. Conflict in our house was something to be postponed indefinitely, usually onto my shoulders. When Charlotte missed deadlines, I was asked to cover her work. When bills arrived, my name ended up on the checks. If I refused one of her asks, Mom suggested I was being petty. If I tried to point out a pattern, Dad would ask me to be the bigger person again, as if moral height could erase the ledger. I became the family's shock absorber, expected to bend, cushion, and smooth out every blow. My patience was read as limitless capacity, and I learned to keep my complaints folded in the corner like receipts you might never use but can't throw away. So I started documenting everything more carefully. I sent texts that asked for confirmation, wrote "loan" in subject lines, and saved screenshots. Not because I wanted to prove people wrong in public, but because I had stopped trusting memory where mine was the only voice raised. When I paid deposits, I used the LLC and signed where it mattered. I made it harder for anyone to pretend favors were gifts. Documentation was my way of staying sane in a family allergic to truth. It didn't make me mean. It made me precise. That precision was the only refusal I could hold on to without losing my footing. I wanted to be seen, not consumed. Ruth's memory was the quiet power that reminded me a different life was possible, one built by cumulative small choices, careful plans, and the refusal to be erased by someone else's applause. I learned how to make informal things formal without yelling about it. If I covered a vendor fee for Charlotte, I took a photo of the receipt, uploaded it to a folder labeled with the month, and sent her a polite message with the attachment. If I lent a car, I saved the odometer photo before and after. I started emailing myself summaries so the dates would be server stamped. Paper receipts went into envelopes labeled by category. Business receipts went into the LLC account. Personal favors went into a separate folder. It sounds tedious, and it was. Tedium was its own armor. There were practical habits that hardened into habit. When money moved, I used the LLC for any event-related transaction. I printed PDFs of agreements and saved a copy to the cloud and a physical copy in a folder with a staple and a sticky note. I learned the little bureaucratic rituals, naming a file 2023 to 5 deposit venue Charlotte so it would surface quickly, backing up to 2 drives, encrypting a folder when the topic felt fragile. Documentation was less about proving people wrong than about keeping myself from doubting my truth. The family house had always been allergic to uncomfortable facts. I became the person who could hand them a fact with a receipt taped to it. Loyalty got confused with capacity so often I almost stopped noticing. Friends assumed I would be the steady recourse. Need a late-night ride? Text Mary. Need a favor on a Sunday? Text Mary. Charlotte assumed the same. Loyalty is a warm word until you realize other people read it like a supply line. I showed up because I believed in the idea of family, in the old-fashioned give and take of it. I assumed reciprocity was a mutual arrangement. It wasn't. My reliability looked less like kindness and more like an open door where others kept walking in with suitcases. Over time, people began to treat my availability as an inexhaustible resource. When I started to say no, the responses were almost always attempts to recalibrate me back to function. Coy indignation, an appeal to sentiment, or small manipulations that made me feel guilty. "You're being dramatic," Charlotte would intone, or someone would casually remind me of how much I always do. Even friends who were otherwise kind normalized asking, then expecting. The worst part was how easy it became for others to profit from my silence. When I didn't speak up, their plans never had to account for me. My quietness made their lives simpler. Their lives being simpler made my grievances harder to justify when I finally raised them. Understanding that was a slow learning. I started to notice that the people who benefited the most from me were the least likely to ask me to claim space. They preferred the version of me who fixed, smoothed, and vanished. So I began to choose where to spend my voice. I kept it for things that mattered: contracts, receipts, timelines, and let smaller slights slide when they truly were small. The gap between loyalty and capacity remained, but at least I learned to say, "I can't," without rewriting myself into a villain. I used to think family was a safety net. In my mind, family was people who would take the fall with you, not for you, but in practice, my family expected me to be the fall. I believed love could be measured by what we did for one another. I wanted my life to be a ledger of mutual care. Instead, the scale was crooked. My side always held the weight. I held on, hoping being useful would eventually translate into being seen. I wanted to be acknowledged for who I was, not only for what I could supply. Ruth had a different model. She kept her calm and paid attention to details. Her life taught me that quiet competence could matter in ways applause never could. When she left that modest inheritance, I felt like I finally had permission to build something that belonged to me, not to my family's needs. I imagined a small shop with stacked tins, the smell of proofing dough, a counter that knew my name not as the person who covered other people's emergencies, but as the person who made something steady and good. That image was my North Star. Choosing peace over permission became a deliberate act. Peace meant stepping back and refusing to be consumed by other people's dramatics. Permission meant waiting for someone to authorize my wants. I chose heat over waiting. I decided I would stop accepting gratitude as a substitute for accountability. I would ask for what I needed and document it. That didn't make me harsh, it made me deliberate. It was a slow, private remolding of expectations, my own foremost. I didn't want to collapse under the illusion of family as automatic safety anymore. Then the ask came. Charlotte called and said the venue needed to be secured with a deposit just until the wedding. She spoke in quick, practiced tones that made you feel like the oversight would be the tragedy. "This is family helping family," she said, as if that deactivated the ledger. Her timeline was tight, non-refundable if delayed, and she painted urgency with the voice of inevitability. She asked me to front the deposit. $40,000. The number landed in my chest with a physical weight like a stone you find in your shoe. I did what I'd started doing. I made it a question of terms. I texted, "I can help, but this will be a loan from the LLC. Repayment by X date. We'll document it." I never left things to oral promises anymore. Charlotte replied almost instantly. "Absolutely." She told me she'd pay me back and that the sum was temporary. Mom called me after, soft and insistent. "Don't be difficult," she said. "It's time sensitive." Ruth would want us together. Her voice mixed nostalgia with pressure. It felt like everyone had conspired to turn my prudence into impatience. I transferred the funds from the LLC's account into the venue escrow. I watched the transfer confirmation scroll across my phone, my thumb hovering over the screen as if I could stop it after I'd already done the part that mattered. My hands smelled faintly of the coffee I drank while I checked numbers. The bank app's green checkmark felt like a doorway closing. I kept a screenshot of the transfer, the transaction ID and a photo of the confirmation, and I emailed the venue a copy with a subject line that included the date and deposit LLC. I did not frame it as generosity. I framed it as a business transaction, and that decision would be crucial later. When I opened the venue contract, I treated it like a map of leverage. The deposit was under my LLC's name, which gave me a sliver of control, but the default language of event agreements always assumes goodwill. I redlined the contract where I needed to, adding a clause that, in plain terms, allowed me to cancel or repurpose the event if the principal parties materially misrepresented facts. I didn't use bulky legalese. I wrote, in clear language, that if the party being celebrated failed to disclose material information that would change a reasonable person's decision to hold the event, I, as the signatory, reserved the right to cancel and repurpose the booking. I kept the deposit under the LLC's account and made sure signature authority remained unambiguous. I emailed the revised draft to the venue sales manager and asked for countersignature. I printed a hard copy and put it in a folder labeled with the date. I saved the email chain where the sales manager acknowledged the clause and confirmed the countersigned PDF. I told Charlotte operationally, "I'll handle the paperwork, you handle design." She texted back, fine, just make it pretty." Her casual dismissal warmed me with an odd fury, the sort that sharpens rather than burns. I taped a sticky note to the printed contract, "Do not trust stories, trust documents." The seating was a map of what mattered. Charlotte set the center and everything else orbited. Mom in her second-best dress, Dad a few chairs back with his hands folded as if he were about to mediate a storm, Daniel flanked by Karen Carter in an expression that could be called polite but tight, Theo hovering too close behind Charlotte like a shadow that didn't belong to anyone. My seat was at the periphery, the table with the spare napkins, the area people sat in when they needed to be practical. I watched the room the way a surgeon watches a patient. Small movements, the slightest flinch, who leaned toward whom when a joke landed. There was a slideshow someone had assembled, one of those montage things meant to make you laugh and cry on cue. 2 slides in, I was the punchline. A photograph of me in a bathrobe, hair in curlers, labeled Mary, family logistics. People chuckled and nudged one another. I could feel the heat of a camera pointed at me from a bridesmaid's phone. It was the kind of intimacy that consumes. The best man, Theo, made a face at Charlotte and mouthed something that might have been a joke. Daniel caught it and looked momentarily unsettled. Karen watched Charlotte with the scrutiny of someone who wanted to believe but didn't know if she had permission. The breeze kept rearranging the ribbons. The music under the chatter was bright and designed to keep emotions moving along a prescribed path. When Charlotte took the microphone, she carried herself as if we were all props in her reveal. She tapped the glass, smiled big, and thanked vendors like a practiced politician thanking donors. It started light, funny anecdotes about college antics, then tightened into theatrical familiarity. She teased at a surprise later, and the bridesmaids leaned in like a chorus waiting for a cue. The jokes began soft and then edged mean. "Boundaries are overrated, right?" she said with a laugh that invited applause and excluded nuance. The room obliged. Small hits were thrown at me in the form of a compliment that wasn't one. "Mary's always practical, so helpful, the person you ask when you want something done and quietly hope it's done right." Laughter followed, the laugh you give when someone else directs the scene and you want to be part of it. Her tone rehearsed cruelty in the way actors rehearse pauses. She practiced the cadence that made exclusion sound like wit. Each joke landed on a clear list of people who'd been complicit. The bridesmaids who laughed the loudest, the cousins who ducked their eyes, Mom clapping in a way that said she agreed with the staging, and Dad avoiding my gaze, hands folded as though he were sheltering from an argument. Daniel's hand flexed on his cufflink and he didn't speak. It was a toast that said, in plain language, who was allowed to belong. The sound of Charlotte saying my name in that context felt like an incision. "Mary Edwards," she said, bright as confetti, "you're not invited to my wedding." The point of a public cruelty is the theater of witness. Eyes swivel, cameras lift, laughter finds its tempo. Someone yelled savage as if cruelty were a clever brand. She followed with a laugh and the line that clipped my future like she was trimming a hedge. "Consider the deposit my gift from you." The phrase landed like a sentence. I watched phones seen my face, the flash catching the moment for friends who would later call it dramatic or funny. I felt the weight shift. I registered names and faces like a ledger balancing itself. I didn't cry. I had learned the most important thing: emotional response is currency in a room like that. If you give sobs, you become the spectacle. If you give fury, the narrative says you're unstable. I took a breath that moved through my chest deliberately and set it down like a tool. I placed my drink on the tower table where nobody would knock it over and let the music swell, using the sound to mark my exit. My steps down the elevator were measured. I photographed the event signage, the seating chart, the photographer's business card tucked inside a program. I copied vendor names from the tent cards and took a mental inventory, something I had learned to do by habit. Note the assets, note the witnesses, keep the record simple and ironclad. Charlotte expected pleading or a spectacle of grief. She wanted the moral high ground. Instead, I left with a playlist of the evening's details in my head. Who laughed, who flinched, who reached for their phones, the exact wording of the line about the deposit. I texted myself a single sentence when the elevator dinged. "Now we begin." That text was unsent to anyone else, a commitment written in my own time-stamped voice. I knew then that the real work would be quieter than any of them expected. I would not give them drama, I would give them structure. The day after, Charlotte asked me to clear out an old storage unit she said was full of college junk. She'd called me because she knew I'd go without question and because she trusted me to clean things up without protest. The unit was slightly dusty, air thick with boxes, and the smell of paper gone warm. I unpacked a shoe box out of habit, the way you undo knots in a necklace. Inside, under a layer of tissue, lay a used paternity test kit in its folded paper sleeve. The dated label on the kit's instruction sheet read 2 years prior. My head calibrated the dates against the child's age. The math fit in a way that raised my skin. There were also hospital bracelets with dates and a name that matched the child's full name. I found a tablet logged into Charlotte's messaging app, and the messages were open on a thread with Theo. They were not ambiguous. There was talk about a swab last month in a tone that treated the act like logistics. They spoke of keeping Daniel in the dark as if deception were merely risk management. The messages were practical, almost bored, discussing how to manage appearances. My hands moved automatically: photograph, export, save. I copied the message thread, stamping the time and the phone metadata, then photographed the paternity kit's barcode and the hospital bracelet numbers. Everything that smelled like a coincidence I treated as potential evidence. I didn't confront Charlotte that day. Confrontation is often theater, and I had learned to prefer the backstage. I closed the storage unit and locked it as I had found it, putting the lid back on the shoe box and replacing the tissue. I made a mental map. This was information, not an accusation delivered in a sob. I took the files to my encrypted drive, created labeled folders with dates, and backed up copies in 2 other secure locations. Chain of custody thoughts ran through my head. Photographs weren't enough if they're not corroborated by controlled DNA testing. The paternity kit was a spark. I needed a flame carefully tended. Silence became a strategy rather than a retreat. I chose not to tell Mom or Dad. Telling them would start a chain reaction of pleas and denials that would scatter the issue into fragments. I didn't post anything online. I didn't tell mutual friends. Instead, I made lists and schedules. I drafted emails to myself in a voice that didn't tremble and set calendar reminders with neutral titles. I printed nothing at home. Every physical copy I made at a business center where no one could ask questions later. I practiced restraint in small, precise ways, deleting drafts of angry messages, not answering calls from people who would want to talk me out of doing anything permanent. The silence around the truth became a hinge for future action, not a cave-in. Choosing silence felt like learning a new muscle. It meant answering exactly when I needed to and otherwise conserving the voice I'd been taught to give away. There was power in withholding the immediate reaction. It rerouted the need for spectacle into a carefully built record. I like to imagine Ruth, quiet hands folded, approving the restraint. Choosing silence over drama was not cowardice. It was preparation. It let me move from being the reactive person who'd always been asked to clean up the scraps to being the one who controlled the narrative by assembling facts so well they could not be shouted away. I kept working, turning every piece of information into a line on a ledger I could show under oath if I had to. She thanked the vendors by name as if saying them made them part of the moment she owned. The florist got a special mention. The pastry chef, an industry nod. She called out Daniel and talked about how steady he'd been, the kind of line you expect from someone about to say, "I do." Then she turned with the smile that made everyone lean forward and said something about logistics, funny, marginal, the kind of joke that draws a smattering of knowing looks. My glass felt heavy in my hand. There was the small, personal touch that makes a toast intimate, a joke about my organizational skills, a laugh that disguised a blade. She raised her glass like a ribboned flag and everyone lifted theirs. The clink sounded rehearsed. She named me with the casual brutality of a practiced speaker. "Mary Edwards," she said, clear and bright, and the sound of my full name in her voice cut differently than an ordinary mention. I noticed the way a camera tilted toward me and the flash flared for a second like a shutter closing on a moment someone else had chosen. There was a small, sour taste in my mouth. She used the word practical as if it were praise, a coat of varnish over inventory, and the room dissolved into the sound of people taking sides without naming them. "You're not invited to my wedding," she said, as if she were closing a door for the comfort of those who would stay inside, making the exclusion feel like curation. After that, she turned the pinch of cruelty into a currency. "Consider the deposit my gift from you," she added, laughing as if the phrase were witty instead of calculated. The bridesmaids laughed in the way people laugh when they're encouraged to be on the winning team. One of them shouted savage like a badge. A phone camera zoomed in on my face. I felt the heat of the spotlight someone had aimed at me and understood in that instant that I'd become an object in her narrative, a means, not a sister. The crowd tumbled forward with their reflexive reactions, some protective, some delighted, many indifferent. The joke had landed on me as the butt, and it echoed around the rooftop in layers. A personal slight, a public foreclosure, a rewriting of my place in the family ledger. Laughter spread like a wave. The bridesmaids giggled the loudest, like a chorus trained to amplify the lead. One of them clapped just once with exaggerated theatricality as if to punctuate the moment. Karen Carter's smile froze the way wax will when held to a flame. It was polite and frightened of making any move that might knit the moment into scandal. Dad's gaze dropped to his hands. He folded them and did the thing he'd always done, small, private withdrawal. Mom clapped with the automatic approval of someone who prefers the house to stay neat. Theo, standing behind Charlotte, smirked as if the reveal had been an inside joke he had helped plan. Daniel put a hand to his mouth and then let it fall. He looked startled in a way that made everything else look like choreography and him the one who'd forgotten his lines. There were small mercies in the room, people who shot glances at me, hunts of sympathy in the corners of eyes, but they were diffuse and soft. A couple of guests murmured, "That's harsh," as if whispering might redeem something. Others pulled out their phones to record, digital witnesses multiplying. The DJ lowered the music for a beat to let the moment breathe, which meant the air smelled of perfume and cold metal and the quiet space between the toast and the reaction. The slideshow we had all seen earlier, mine included, circulated in people's heads like a reminder that I'd always been cast in the back for the punchline. It was striking how quickly laughter could feel like company and how quickly it could calcify into complicity. I didn't cry. I had rehearsed the absence of spectacle like a vow. Years of being the reliable one taught me that showing pain publicly often hands your opponents the script. If you sob, they get to call you unstable. If you plead, they get to draw the curtain and say you overreacted. I took a breath that felt deliberate, the way a surgeon draws in air before a cut, and let it sit. I set my glass down with the tiniest care and smoothed my jacket as if smoothing fabric could adjust the world. My hands stayed steady because I understood that my voice was a tool and that rage or tears would be a toll booth they could exploit. I wanted to be seen clear-eyed, not at the mercy of drama. I admired her capacity for theater without participating. My face was still. I let the camera frames collect me but didn't offer them any more than their lens would take. I heard the click of a strap from someone's bag, a phone chimed. I felt small pricks of heat in my cheeks that weren't tears. I tightened my jaw, counted each inhale, and cataloged everything: who laughed first, who had the gall to cheer, whose smile froze. When Charlotte blew a kiss toward her circle, I let the movement pass like a gust. My limbs moved on a schedule. I stood, smoothed the back of my dress at the hip without fanfare, and walked toward the exit in the measured way of someone who is consciously pacing grief. My exit was not dramatic. I walked out with the same controlled stride I'd used my whole life when asked to be the adult in a child's quarrel. On the way, I took quick, precise actions because details later would be facts. I photographed the event signage and the seating chart, capturing vendor names with my phone camera. I slid the photographer's business card into the program and tucked it into my bag. The DJ's booth had a small placard with the company name. I snapped it. I copied the caterer's napkin imprint and noted the florist's card sitting under a vase. These were small facts, bricks in the wall of whatever I planned next. I walked 2 blocks before I called for a rideshare. I let the evening breathe around me, the smell of the river swapped for car exhaust, the city lights a soft serenity compared to the rooftops' flash. At home, I backed up the screenshots from the night into an encrypted folder. I drafted a clean timeline in a notes app: event, date, words said, witnesses. I deleted the draft of a text I almost sent Mom, an angry thing that would have pushed the issue into family chaos rather than into a legal frame. The phrase, "now we begin," sat on my phone as a single text I'd sent to myself in the elevator earlier. I reread it and felt the simple satisfaction of a time-stamped promise. There was no social media post, no public lament. The plan required patience, not spectacle, and I had always been better at the slow work. I called Victor Miles and asked if we could meet in person. He met me in the venue office, a small room that smelled faintly of coffee and floor polish, his expression the practiced calm of someone who'd spent his life making people's days go smoothly. I walked him through the clause and explained what I intended to do if the facts proved different from the narrative presented to guests. He read the countersigned copy, nodded, and asked 2 practical questions. How clean was my documentation, and could we handle a daytime flip without disrupting vendors? I gave him the file folder with the email chain, the deposit confirmation, and the countersigned document. He looked at the dates and the correspondence and said, "If your paperwork is that clean, I will coordinate." That was the professional assent I needed, someone with keys and staff willing to act. I made 3 hard copies of everything and put them in separate sealed envelopes. One went into my bag, one I left in a safe deposit box across town, and the third I handed to a trusted attorney to hold in escrow. I also saved a digital copy to an encrypted cloud folder and emailed myself the certified countersigned document with a time-stamped note. It felt almost ceremonial, the small rituals that turn plans into facts. The contract was the legal backbone of the day. If anything else failed, the document would be the muscle that made consequences real. Finding the paternity evidence felt less like discovery and more like walking into a room already set with clues. I cataloged everything with a methodical calm. I photographed the paternity kit's instruction sheet, the lot number, and the barcode, then took a close-up of the used swab sleeve and the dates printed on the packaging. The hospital bracelets had hospital names and dates embossed. I photographed the bracelets against a neutral background and took a secondary photo with a ruler for scale. All of the digital files I named in a strict pattern. Year, month, day, item type. That naming convention made retrieval later clean and fast. It meant nothing to anyone who might stumble across the folder, but everything to me. I exported Charlotte's message thread with Theo, saving a copy with metadata intact so timestamps couldn't be dismissed as altered. I kept screenshots and also saved the raw message export in a format the lab's administrative people might accept if they needed to verify authenticity. I made a written index that cross-referenced each piece of evidence: message number, timestamp, reference to the paternity kit, hospital bracelet number, and any mention in the thread that suggested deliberate concealment. I placed the physical items, bracelets and kit, into sealed, labeled evidence bags and photographed each bag's seal. It felt absurdly procedural, like a scene from a crime show, but detail is a poor thing to skip when you want someone to believe you. Once I had the items cataloged, I locked the physical evidence in a secure box and moved it to another safe deposit box. Digital copies went into 2 encrypted cloud locations and an external hard drive stored in a safety deposit. I set up a read-only folder and shared access only with my attorney. The fewer hands that touched the documentation, the better. I was building a record that could stand up to challenges because it was messy and ordinary in its preservation. Receipts, timestamps, seals. If anyone tried to say I'd manufactured the evidence, the paper trail would be louder than words. Chain of custody mattered in a way that felt academic until I thought about how fragile the truth is in a room full of people with motives. I talked to a reputable laboratory that did family testing and asked their intake manager the practical questions. What proves continuity? How do they notarize? What records do they produce? They recommended supervised samples with notarized identification, sealed custody bags, and a written chain of custody log that they would sign at each transfer point. I took notes and repeated the terms back until they sounded right. Chain of custody was not a ceremony of intimidation. It was a sequence of simple actions that made it harder for anyone to say later that the sample was swapped or tampered with. The lab advised that if I wanted the strongest record, all parties should provide supervised samples on a recorded chain of custody form with photo identification and a notary present when the sample was sealed. The logistics sounded daunting, but the lab's rep made it practical. A mobile collection on a specific date, a courier to take the sealed sample directly to the lab, and a notarized report returned with a seal. I booked the mobile service and told the lab our timeline. They set aside the date and reserved a notary for the window I gave them. Knowing the exact steps calmed something in me. The work reduced the ache into tasks with checkboxes. Extracting Theo's DNA required a small, carefully staged kindness. I organized a charity event in Ruth's name, an afternoon health drive with a community feel that fit the story I needed to tell publicly. I kept the event description honest, a small fundraiser for a scholarship in Ruth's memory with optional health checks and community outreach. I invited volunteers and asked for help from local organizations. I also invited Theo to volunteer for outreach. He agreed, eager to be seen as generous. He said yes because it fit his image of public goodwill and because he'd never had to answer for private truths in public. On the day, I set up a discreet collection station with clear signage about voluntary cheek swab collection for a community health project. The lab's mobile technician and the notary were there, both introduced to Theo by me as vendors supporting the event. The notary sat visibly at the table with the lab technician, and the collection bag, a simple unmarked envelope with a printed consent form on top, sat in the middle. Theo signed a general consent form to participate in the health drive, documents that in themselves were ordinary. The lab technician asked for photo identification and recorded the name and a coded participant number. I made sure the camera angle captured the exchange. The notary added a public signature and stamped the form. Theo sat for the cheek swab, smiling for the volunteer shot, unaware that the sample would carry a chain of custody that led back to the specifics I already had cataloged. He signed, the notary verified his ID, and the technician swabbed the inside of his cheek with a sterile collection stick. The sample was placed into a tamper-evident bag labeled with the coded number, and the notary dated and signed the seal. The bag was logged in the chain of custody form with the participant code, time, and signatures. A courier was booked to take the sealed sample directly to the lab under tracked service. The whole thing was simple and public and looked like the kind of community service event people like to be seen attending. When the lab sent back the results, the envelope had the weight of a verdict. It was a formal package. The notarized report, a plain language summary, and the official chain of custody signed at each transfer point. The report confirmed what the earlier artifacts had suggested. The tested sample matched Theo's profile as the biological father. The comparison sample, where appropriate, showed that Daniel was not. The lab provided a signed chain of custody statement describing every hand the sample passed through and included copies of the notary's acknowledgement. I opened the sealed folio at my kitchen table and felt a small, steadying relief. I made 2 certified copies of the notarized results. One copy I kept in the leather folio I'd prepared for the day. The original went into the safe deposit box with the other critical documents. I drafted a 1-page summary that cross-referenced the messages, the paternity kit, and the lab results in a plain, factual layout. That summary was the bridge between raw evidence and public presentation. I emailed the lab's notarized statement to my attorney and asked him to prepare the civil claim paperwork. Then I sat very still for 10 minutes because the work was done in the quiet way that matters, not flashy, not vindictive, just undeniably true. I also wrote a vendor notice template that honored the professionals who would otherwise be collateral. It told caterers, florists, photographers, and the DJ, event repurposed by contracting signatory, payment terms intact, vendors will be paid. I did not want anyone's paycheck to be a weapon in someone else's hands. I included copies of the countersigned contract and the deposit confirmation so vendors could see the chain of authority. My attorney filed a preliminary notice with the county clerk so there would be a public record that the claim existed, and we left the filing window open should faster action be necessary. I kept the tone quiet in all correspondence. Legal leverage is less about shouting and more about making the path forward clear and easy to follow. If Charlotte tried to fight on emotional grounds, she'd have to answer the ledger. If she tried to spin the story publicly, the paperwork would already be filed and time-stamped. The claim was not an act of vengeance, it was a procedural assertion of what the documents already said. That framing helped me sleep in small stretches because I trusted the mechanics even when my head was loud. As the legal scaffolding settled, I built the public staging the way a carpenter builds a frame before drywall. I hired Naomi Brooks because she is not theatrical. She is neutral, precise, and has a voice people listen to without feeling led. I booked an LED billboard truck and preloaded it with a simple loop. The lab header, a plain timeline, redacted screenshots that still made the pattern visible, and a first slide that read in neutral type, "Correction and announcement from a contracting party." I kept the tone flat and factual because flatness feels harder to argue with in public. Victor Miles at the Bellwether agreed to coordinate the physical flip. The staff, the floor plan, the quick move from ceremony set to luncheon set. We planned a layout that would allow guests to be guided from the steps into the ballroom without confusion, with programs at the door explaining the repurpose and a card at the gift table that read, "Ruth Edwards Culinary Scholarship, donations welcomed." I asked for a printed program because in-person paper gives a fact weight that screens sometimes don't. I made a simple 1-page summary that mirrored the documents I would present. The contract clause, the loan ledger, and the notarized lab result header. It was direct and unemotional, designed so guests could read it before they had to choose sides. I also created a read-only online folder and generated a QR code linking to the notarized files, the screenshots, and the ledger. The LED loop included that code for anyone who wanted to see the documents in full. I rehearsed with Naomi the phrasing she would use, neutral, anchored, and not an accusation. Victor and I timed the staff movements like a choreography. The whole thing had to feel inevitable and orderly so that there was no place for spectacle to unseat the facts. The run of show was a script of minimal lines and maximal clarity. Arrival, Charlotte's limo, step out, a mic check from me, Naomi standing just off to the side. On signal. I open the folio, tap the mic, speak the opening sentence that gives the axis for the day. Naomi reads a plain timeline aloud. Victor steps forward to announce cancellation per signatory instruction. The LED switches on, Paul Jensen serves papers, and the venue pivots to the luncheon. Emails to the guest list were scheduled to send the second. Naomi said, "Please check your inbox." I practiced 3 lines until they were muscle memory. I am the contracting signatory. I am canceling this ceremony and repurposing the booking per clause, and please check your inbox for documents. No ad-libbing. No pleading, no gloating. The fewer words the better when the facts do the work. I rehearsed the physical small moves, how I would hold the folio so the lab's seal faced outward, how I'd tap the mic once, how I would step back the moment Victor spoke. I rehearsed to stay emotionally neutral because my plan relied on optics. Calmness equals control. I told Mom I was handling vendor confirmations so she would stay near the venue and not accidentally meet me on the steps and try to talk me down. I told her it was a small administrative thing and she believed me. Her trust gave me the cover I needed. The story everyone would tell before the punchline was that I was the practical one tying up loose ends. That was true, and it made the reveal cleaner. On the church steps, I felt the air the way you feel it right before a bell rings, the little tension that lives in the spaces between people. The folio was warm from being held. The leather creaked softly as I opened it and let the sunlight catch the lab seal. Naomi stood a step behind me, tablet in hand, her face set to neutral. Victor hovered near the side door, his expression a careful blend of professional calm and readiness. Paul Jensen, process server, stood a few paces behind me with the manila envelope and a posture I trusted. The LED truck idled at the curb, screens dark, the quiet deliberate before a reveal. Charlotte stepped from the limo, veil pinned, smile already in place because she had rehearsed this whole life as a stage. When her foot hit the step and she saw the seal glinting in the sun, her smile stuttered. I felt something in her face untangle. My pulse was steady because this was not about spectacle, it was about procedure. Guests turned to see what the small group at the steps had gathered for. Phones lifted. Daniel adjusted his cufflinks as if ignoring me would move the world. Theo stood a little to the side, the person who had kept secrets, and he did not meet my eyes. It all looked exactly like the board I'd sketched in my head for weeks. I tapped the mic once so it would register and said the line that started everything. "Before anyone walks inside, we need to correct the record." The sound of my voice was calm, even. I stated plainly, I am the contracting signatory for today's venue, booked under my limited liability company. I held the folio up so the lab's seal caught light and added the next sentence without hesitation. Per Clause 6 of the agreement, material misrepresentation by principal parties grants me the right to cancel and repurpose this booking. I said the clause's point in a single, simple sentence because complexity invites argument and I had no interest in inviting one. Victor stepped forward then, exactly as we'd rehearsed. His voice carried the few practical words that made the plan enforceable. Per the signatory's instruction and the terms of the agreement, this ceremony is canceled. He did not shout. He did not flourish. He stated the administrative fact like someone confirming a delivery. At that moment, the LED truck sparked and the first slide came alive. Event change. Scholarship luncheon honoring Ruth Edwards. The screens switched in an instant from black to plain factual text, and then the loop of the timeline and the redacted screenshots began to scroll. A murmur traveled through the crowd, phones found inboxes, guests looked confused as they read their programs, ushers handed out the new one-page summaries. I felt the room reorient itself around the documents more than around the drama. That was the point, to let the paperwork do the work so there was nowhere for theatrics to hide the truth. The contract clause hadn't been noise, it was the hinge. When the hinge turns, doors move. I stood still and let it. Naomi stayed on script. She didn't read accusations, she read a timeline that showed intent. The slideshow on the screen cycled screenshots of messages I'd saved, carefully redacted for privacy, where the language about keeping Daniel in the dark and planning swabs appeared. The crowd was quiet enough you could hear the wind across the church steps. Some people scanned the QR code that appeared on the LED and watched documents download to their phones in real time. I kept the folio visible, the lab seal in the sun, so anyone who wanted to look could see the notarized stamp and the lab letterhead. The effect was less theatrical than absolute truth laid out with stamps and dates. Then Paul walked forward, manila envelope in hand, moving like someone delivering mail on a normal Tuesday because that ordinary motion made everything else proven. He read, "Charlotte Edwards, you are being served." He handed her the civil claim for fraudulent appropriation and unjust enrichment. Charlotte's hands trembled for a moment as the papers entered her custody. The crowd watched the transfer with an almost embarrassed silence. I stated the demand out loud: $40,000 plus costs, return the funds within 30 days or we will proceed. I was careful to keep the words neutral and clear. This wasn't spectacle. It was an administrative step. The papers were in her hands and the record existed. After the papers were served, I addressed the vendors briefly and plainly. I said the payments due to them would be honored. I didn't want anyone's paycheck to be collateral damage in a family conflict. The LED truck cycled to show the ledger entries, the bank transfer confirmation, the deposit contract in my LLC's name, and emails where the venue acknowledged the clause. People looked at the documents and then at Charlotte in a new light. Her options narrowed visibly. You could see her brain working through defense strategies and finding few clean exits. Her face shifted from pale to a kind of brittle anger, the anger of someone who realizes the rules have changed and they're not winning anymore. Victor moved quickly with the sort of quiet efficiency that makes small chaos manageable. Staff shifted tables, took down the artwork, and the ballroom began to change shape in fast, practiced steps. Naomi invited guests to enter the ballroom for a luncheon honoring Ruth Edwards, and the new programs were handed out at the door. The floral arrangements were rearranged from arch to centerpieces in less than half an hour. The DJ swapped tracks from wedding playlist to soft instrumental. The caterers adjusted their serving plan without hesitation because they'd seen the vendor notice and the pay confirmations. A card at the gift table now read Ruth Edwards Culinary Scholarship, and a discreet QR code for donations appeared on the now visible screens. People moved inside with a kind of measured curiosity. Some whispered in small groups, others scanned the documents on their phones, and a few simply sat and accepted coffee offered by the staff. Naomi guided the room with a steady tone. This luncheon is in memory of Ruth Edwards. Please join us. There was no cheering, no jeering, just a slow pivot as if everyone had been handed a new itinerary. Some guests approached me quietly to thank me for handling vendors. Others looked at Charlotte with a mix of pity and judgment. Vendors continued their work. The caterer smiled and told me in a low voice they appreciated the clarity. The luncheon filled its seats and donations began quietly at the first table. The event had become productive in a way the wedding would never have been. When I finally spoke to the assemblage, I kept it short. My voice didn't shake because I'd practiced brevity as a defense. Corrections are hard, I said. Accountability is harder. I pointed to the printed program people had been given and said, all documents are available for review. I'm repurposing this day in honor of Ruth and her passion for culinary education. I said nothing about motives, offered no gloating, and issued no public condemnation. I wanted the facts to stand and not to be clouded by my anger. I thanked the vendors by name for their professionalism and the venue staff for their speed. Then I invited people to eat, donate if they wished, and otherwise make their own choices. I said one last thing before stepping back and letting Naomi take the mic. No one here has to take a side in public. The documents are available. Choose your own conclusions. I felt my face cool as I gave that instruction. It was important to me that people leave with agency and not with a sense they'd been forced into a spectacle. I didn't look at Charlotte as I spoke. I didn't want to give her the satisfaction of drawing my gaze. I stepped away and watched as conversations split into those who would defend her privately and those who would look at the paperwork and make different choices. The room filled with a sober hum. The consequences for Charlotte were not immediate theater, they were slow and surgical. Her reputation in the community shifted the way a picture fades under light, gradually but inevitably. The email I had scheduled went out that afternoon to the guest list and a few local contacts. Screenshots of the notarized results and the message threads began to circulate in private messages and small group chats. Vendors who had been friendly while they were paid began to distance themselves. The planning group chat that had once buzzed with color palettes and seating options went silent and then returned with sharp, defensive messages from people asking if she'd paid deposits or owed balances. Charlotte tried to manage damage in public with forgiving posts and staged sincerity, but the documents made those posts feel hollow. People asked for proof, and when the notarized files and ledger entries were available, the tone shifted from sympathy to scrutiny. Her civil response was bluster at first, claims of misunderstanding, of being overwhelmed, but my attorney's reply was methodical and referenced specific dates and emails. The press of clear records left her with fewer persuasive stories to tell. Donations that had been pledged to the wedding shower slowly disappeared, replaced by a trickle of awkward messages asking whether they'd been credited back. At home, Mom cycled between denial and sharp anger. She called me a few times and left voicemails that mixed sorrow with anger at me for what she called making family business public. Dad stopped answering calls for a week. I didn't engage in those cycles. Charlotte faced the brick wall consequences of being exposed before the people whose opinion mattered most to her, family, friends, and the community that had supported wedding plans. The fracture wasn't merely social, it was financial and procedural too. Contracts were checked, vendor relationships reevaluated, and a few friendly people I once relied on quietly told me they were relieved someone had finally set the record straight. His attempts to discredit the lab felt desperate and petty. He messaged mutual friends claiming the sample was taken under false pretenses, that he'd been tricked into a routine volunteer thing. The notary's signature and the lab's timeline made that argument thin, and it made Theo look like someone trying to rewrite his own choices. The text messages he sent to Charlotte pleading, then bargaining, then issuing threats appeared in a pattern that made people uncomfortable rather than sympathetic. He met with a lawyer, I learned through a mutual acquaintance, and the lawyer's face wasn't the kind that promised quick miracles. Paternity issues have procedures and obligations that move slower than the kind of charm Theo had once relied on. I archived his messages without replying. I kept a folder labeled with dates and saved copies in the same encrypted space where everything else lived. He sent apologies that alternated between sincerity and blame. He tried to explain his absence as fear, and he tried to reframe things as private mistakes. The public records didn't care for his feelings. Mutual friends quietly unfollowed or muted him on social media. Invitations stopped arriving for the casual events he'd once attended. The social consequences were precise. Doors he thought permanent found themselves closing without drama, one polite decline at a time. He learned the hard way that your public persona is a fragile construction when paired against notarized facts. Daniel's exit was slower and less performative. He needed time to recalibrate. There was a kind of grief that wasn't about betrayal as much as it was about being deceived by someone he'd trusted. He came to me the day after the luncheon and asked to see the folio. I handed it to him without comment. He sat at my kitchen table and read through the documents, his jaw moving without words. When he looked up, his eyes were red-rimmed but steady. "Thank you for not making a scene," he said simply. It wasn't an apology, it was acknowledgement. There was relief in his voice, like an old knot finally cut. He moved out within days, carefully and without spectacle. Karen, his mother, helped with logistics in the way she'd learned in her own life, practical, quiet, and without theatrics. She sent a short text the week after. "If you need anything, let me know." He sent one line to me, "You returned my time to me." I replied, "Take care." That was the last direct back and forth because I had decided my role wasn't to offer counsel or consolation. I had given him the facts, the door, and the folio. From there, his path was his own. Mom called a handful of times in the weeks after and left voicemails that mixed anger with a form of maternal hurt. "We raised them as close," she said once, voice tight. Dad seemed to withdraw further, his calls went unanswered more often. I set boundaries at the level of schedules. I told Mom plainly that I would not mediate between adults who had acted as adults. When she asked me, with her voice softening into pleading, if I could fix this for Charlotte, I answered the way a professional would, "That's not my role." The sentence felt sharp against whatever old pattern wanted me to step in and smooth edges. Maintaining that distance was hard in private but necessary. Boundaries in this family used to be porous. I was learning to keep them firm. The bakery dream, the one Ruth's modest gift had helped seed, found oxygen in the most practical of ways after the luncheon. Donations came in that surprised me, small at first, then steadier. A neighbor's check, a pledge from a local caterer who'd admired the way I handled vendors, an anonymous gift through the scholarship QR code. Victor connected me with a caterer who had extra kitchen hours and was willing to sublet at cost for a short term. Karen quietly became my first regular client, ordering platters for her office once a week. Her orders started small and became a reliable rhythm. The scholarship fund we launched in Ruth's name gathered momentum. People wanted to give to something that felt constructive instead of partisan. I reopened the LLC account and moved funds back where they belonged, eventually covering the initial deposit line item as the civil claim process worked its slow machinery. I negotiated with vendors, Victor and I handled invoices and made sure no one was left unpaid because I had no stomach for harming people who'd done their jobs. The community's practical support mattered more than any dramatic endorsement. I began renting kitchen time, refining recipes at dawn, and testing a laminated menu with the sort of stubborn joy that has nothing to do with revenge. My soft opening was a weeknight with 8 chairs and 2 neighborly critics who told me to use more salt. The first morning I put out sourdough loaves. A woman from the luncheon arrived with cash and the exact sincere look of someone who wanted to support a local dream. There was a new kind of power that came from having options. The deposit reclaimed under the civil process was not a feast but a tool. It let me cover equipment repairs and inventory without borrowing from family again. Vendors began to treat me as a client rather than a crisis manager. Karen's office ordered more frequently, and a small local paper ran a piece on the scholarship and my launch, framed as community restoration rather than scandal. I hired one part-time baker and paid them on a schedule that made them feel secure. The shop's counter held Ruth's framed photograph and a small sign explaining the scholarship fund. People who had once treated me as background now took a number at the counter and waited politely because the bread was worth the wait. If the luncheon had been the moment of restitution, the bakery was the slow closing of a loop. I didn't open to prove anything to Charlotte. I opened because the work of making something steady was how I wanted to live. My silence had become intent, and that intent showed in the little daily rhythms. The first burnished crust of day-old baguettes, the sound of the early oven breath, the cashier's polite "have a good day." Those small elements were the real victory, sustained, ordinary, and mine. If this story resonated with you, tell me a version of it in the comments. I read every one. Subscribe and turn on notifications to hear more first-person family revenge stories, and watch the next video when you're ready for another clean ending.